Everyone thought the German Shepherd was just another abandoned dog, but when a stranger walked in, everything changed. The German Shepherd lifted his head, locked eyes with the man, and began to cry. What happened next left everyone in tears. It was a miracle no one would ever forget. In the farthest corner of the county animal shelter, a German Shepherd lay curled in a tight ball, his nose tucked beneath his tail. Day after day, he barely moved. The shelter workers called him Shadow because he hardly made a sound, just watched people with those haunted, searching eyes. No one knew exactly how long he'd been wandering before animal control picked him up, but it was clear from the first moment that he was looking for something, or someone, he'd lost. The other dogs barked and jumped whenever visitors passed their kennels, desperate for attention. But Shadow stayed in his corner, silent as if hoping that if he was quiet enough, he might hear familiar footsteps coming to find him. Volunteers tried everything to comfort him: warm blankets, soft voices, treats he never touched. It was like he'd given up on everyone except the memory of the person he loved. Each evening when the lights dimmed, he would lift his head, listening as the shelter doors closed. His ears would flick forward, straining for a sound he never heard. Then he would sigh, a soft, defeated exhale, and rest his chin on the cold concrete floor to anyone watching. He looked like just another stray whose spirit had been broken by too much loss. But inside that quiet heart, a fragile hope still flickered, waiting for the one face that might make the darkness lift. And in the stillness of that kennel, Shadow kept holding on. David hadn't planned on stopping by the shelter that morning. He'd told himself over and over that it was time to let go, that maybe his dog was gone for good. But every time he tried to move on, he'd wake up thinking he heard paws scratching at the back door or feel the weight of a familiar head on his knee. For nearly a year, those memories had been all he had left. Clutched in his hand was an old photograph, its edges soft and worn from countless times he'd pulled it from his wallet. In the picture, a younger David grinned into the camera, an arm slung around a big German Shepherd with bright, trusting eyes. Back then, life had felt solid, dependable. They'd been inseparable, partners in every sense of the word. Friends had gently suggested he stop searching. It's been too long, they'd say. You need to heal. But they didn't understand. Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was family. He was the only soul who'd never let David down, never judged him, never left his side until the day he'd vanished. Today, something had pulled David out of bed and steered him toward the shelter on the edge of town. Maybe it was foolish hope. Maybe it was the last flicker of faith he couldn't let die. As he parked and stepped out into the cold morning air, he took a steadying breath. One more time, he promised himself. One last place to look before he gave up for good. David walked slowly down the concrete aisle, the echo of his boots mixing with the restless chorus of barking. Kennel after kennel blurred past. Some dogs leapt at the fencing, tails wagging in hopeful bursts. Others cowered in the corners, too scared to look up. He paused here and there, studying each face, willing himself to feel something familiar. But every time, disappointment sank heavier in his chest. He was halfway down the row when doubt finally started to crush the fragile hope he'd carried in. Maybe this really was it. Maybe the trail ended here, in a building full of stories that never found their happy endings. He stopped, hand drifting to the photograph in his pocket, and closed his eyes. A year was a long time to keep believing. When he opened them again, his gaze fell on the farthest kennel. A German Shepherd lay curled in the shadows, so still he almost looked like a statue. For a moment, David's heart skipped, too afraid to trust what he saw. He took a hesitant step closer, then another. The dog didn't move. But something, some instinct, told David to keep going. He stepped up to the chain-link gate, fingers curling around the cold metal. The shepherd lifted his head, slow and heavy, as if it took every ounce of strength he had left. Their eyes met, and the rest of the shelter seemed to fall away. In that single, silent moment, David felt the truth bloom in his chest. He'd found him. For a breathless moment, neither of them moved. David's hand trembled against the gate. The German Shepherd stared up at him, ears lifting a fraction. It was as though he was seeing a ghost, something too good to believe. David swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. Shadow, he whispered, the name catching in his throat like a prayer he'd almost forgotten how to say. The dog flinched, head tilting, as if some part of him was fighting to trust what he heard. David took a step closer, pressing his palm flat against the wire mesh. "It's me, boy. I'm here." His voice broke on the last word, a tear sliding down his cheek. The shepherd inched forward, belly low to the ground. He sniffed the air, then pressed his nose to the fence where David's hand waited. A keening sound rose from his chest, thin, high-pitched, almost like a cry. Another followed, and another, until the dog's body shook with soft, desperate sobs. Shelter staff, drawn by the noise, gathered at the end of the aisle. No one spoke. A hush settled over the kennels. Even the other dogs falling quiet as they watched the shepherd drag himself closer, pressing his face into the gap near the latch. David felt his heart splinter and mend all at once. He dropped to his knees, unable to stop the tears. "You waited for me," he whispered. Shadow let out a final, broken whimper, one of recognition and relief that a shelter worker, her eyes damp, knelt beside David. Do you know this dog?" she asked softly, though the answer was already clear. David pulled the worn photograph from his pocket, smoothing the creases with shaking fingers. "This is him," he said hoarsely. "His name is Shadow. He's mine." The woman took the picture, comparing the bright-eyed shepherd in the photo to the dog pressed desperately against the gate. Though Shadow was thinner now, his fur dull and patched, the same white blaze streaked his chest. A small scar on his right ear, proof of an old scrape with a barbed wire fence, matched perfectly. She looked up, nodding. "There's no doubt." Shadow pawed at the latch with a soft whine, as if he couldn't stand one more second of distance. David's hand slipped through the gap to touch his muzzle. The dog leaned into it with a shuddering sigh, eyes closing in sheer relief. "We'll get the paperwork started right now," the worker said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anything like this." As she hurried off, David stayed kneeling, forehead resting against the cool metal. He didn't care that people were watching. All that mattered was the feeling of Shadow's warm breath against his palm. Minutes later, when the gate finally swung open, Shadow hesitated only long enough to look up into David's eyes. Then he lunged forward, burying his face in David's chest. And for the first time in a year, they were whole again. Shadow refused to leave David's side as they walked out of the shelter. Each step felt like waking from a long, terrible dream. The staff stood by the door, smiling through tears, as if they, too, knew this was something special. When they reached the parking lot, Shadow paused, glancing up at David with questioning eyes, almost as if to ask, "Is it really over?" David knelt beside him, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. "We're going home," he whispered, voice raw but steady. Shadow pressed closer, tail thumping softly, and for the first time since he'd disappeared, there was no fear in his eyes, only trust. The drive home was quiet. Shadow lay stretched across the back seat, his head resting in David's lap. Every so often, he let out a contented sigh, as though reassuring himself this wasn't a dream. David kept one hand on his fur, unwilling to break the connection even for a moment. The sun broke through the clouds as they pulled into the driveway, painting everything in golden light. Neighbors peeked from their porches, astonished to see the dog they'd all assumed was gone forever. A few came over to welcome them back, offering cautious smiles. David just nodded, too full to speak. He led Shadow inside, where familiar smells and soft rugs waited. That night, as the house grew quiet, Shadow curled up at the foot of David's bed. For the first time in a year, he slept peacefully, safe, loved, and finally home again.